Welcome to Shop Talk Live, episode number 328. Today, I sit down with Vic and Mike, and we talk about precision. Precision and where it's needed and where it's wanted and where it's wasted. But if you're like me and you like to be precise with your woodworking, and Mike and Vic as well, of course, you might want to check out Bob Van Dyke's Essential Table Saw Jigs e-learning course on findwoodworking.com/e-learning. If you sign up now, you can get in on the live Q&A session that will be happening next week, November 7th. And yeah, it's basically Bob showing you how to make all of those essential jigs. Crosscut sled, tenoning jig, L fence, just all of the things you need to make your table saw work harder for you. Just laid out. It's like, I think 7 hours long or something like that. And it's really great. Bob, as you know, is just got it dialed in like nobody else. So head on over to findwoodworking.com/e-learning and check that out right now. And yeah, let's start this episode.
I told a story about Mike on a podcast the other day.
Ooh, was it a good story?
It's Mike. I don't know if you remember doing this or not, but during one of the Fine Woodworking Lives, you did a talk about the block plane. Okay. And I sat in on the class because I thought if I'm going to learn anything else about block planes, it's probably going to be from Mike. So I sat in and I ended up taking notes. Anyway, somebody in the room was doing that sort of self-stroking ego thing where they're like, they put up their hand to ask a question, but then they go on to like sort of pontificate about the way they do things. Mm-hmm. And then the question part came after about like a 5-minute soliloquy. Have you ever thought about doing it like that, Mike? And I don't know if you remember, but you affected this sort of pensive kind of look down at the bench thing, and then you looked right up at him and you said, no. And then you moved right on.
I was worried about what you were going to say. Okay.
You just said no. You didn't know. And then you just... And so we were talking on this, I don't know if you ever heard of the Green Suitors podcast. It's Brian Sedgley.
Like Festool Brian, right?
Yeah. Brian Sedgley and Jason Bent, who's a YouTube guy, and then Ronnie, who's another guy. Anyway, it's an interesting podcast. They've got a pretty cool following. Anyway, we were talking about classes and how, because they thought it was interesting that I don't like to teach group classes, that I prefer doing one-on-one stuff because, of all the, and then we started talking about all the idiots that you get in the classes who spend a couple $100,000 to take a class and then proceed to try to tell you how to do it.
Yes.
And so it's just like, and then we talked about Megan Fitzpatrick, who was teaching and a guy in the class was like mansplaining woodworking to her. And she was like, you've either got a ton of money or you're just dumb as all get it. Because,
she would just say that.
Because she's like, if you spent all this money to come here and tell me that everything I'm doing is wrong, then I got nothing for you.
Yeah.
And I thought that was just friggin' brilliant, And Megan, of course, she's the art of not giving whoops about what she says.
I already got to bleep something.
Oh. Whoops.
Well, I mean, for me, the question is usually phrased as, do you know how such and such does that? And at first it's like, kind of like you said, well, this is kind of the way I do it. And, but I think a lot of times people learn something a specific way from a woodworker, and then they see someone else doing it differently. And I think right away that question in their mind comes up. It's like, oh no, am I doing it wrong? Like, which one of you is right? And so I always tend to back up. And the good thing about working at Fine Woodworking is I kind of know how everybody does everything.
Right.
And, and what I don't really say is that, not that my way is the best way, but it is sort of informed by knowing a lot of ways to do it. But the bigger thing I try to talk about is like, there's no one way to do it. There's a lot of good ways to do it. And if you've learned one way to do it and you're taking a class, my recommendation is like, hey, you're here, give it a try this way. And then you know two ways to do it and you can decide which way you want. But yeah, I think that I try to make that an opening statement on every single class. It's like, this is just a way. There's a lot of ways to go about doing it. It makes sense to me. I'll explain why this makes sense to me, but yeah, a lot of ways to do it. And then sometimes there's certain things where we're making real pieces of furniture in a class. And if someone's like, yeah, you know what, I tried it, I'm just more confident doing it this way, and this is a real furniture part, I'm like, more power to you. Just do it the way that you want to do it now. So yeah, I get all that. I get all those questions. But yeah, my wife used to teach first grade, and the phrase she always used when someone raised their hand and started talking, she would say, that's a story, not a question. So,
and there's no stories allowed right now.
No. So that phrase does come to mind on occasion. Yes. When people have a question or a statement kind of couched as a question. Yeah.
Well, and
That's
it's interesting
good too.
because I recently had an opportunity to take a class with Andrew Hunter. He was doing a class at
Wendell Castle, right?
At Wendell Castle, yeah, and he was about how to basically get start with a wooden block die and a plain blade and marry them together. It was a 2-day class. It was so informative, and so I almost was sort of like sitting at the back of the class, not wanting to put my hand up or ask any questions, because it's like, I don't want anybody to think that like I'm challenging what he's saying. And because I'm conscious of that, because, sometimes it happens. And so, but yeah, I can learn anything from anybody. Because, you never know when someone's going to pull out some little trick that you're like, oh, I never thought about that. And it doesn't make your way wrong. It just makes it different. And it's always cool to explore, different ways to do it.
I feel like that's a class that you would take, Mike.
What's that?
Andrew Hunter, like tuning up a Japanese plane?
Yes, I would love to. And I've been meaning to, because, fine, I'll say it. I'm the one who suggested to Andrew and to Bob, because he was doing kind of like a weekend of Japanese tools. And it was like a lot of information and a lot of people kind of listening to it, which was fine. But I said, do a class where you start with a Japanese hand plane, because that's just the starting point. And over the weekend, have everybody tune up the hand plane and they get to leave with a hand plane. And I did that for very selfish reasons, because I wanted to know how to tune up a Japanese hand plane and also buy one. So that's a class I would love to take, and I just haven't sort of kind of scheduled things around to where I can take that class. So yeah, Andrew Hunter, if you ever have a chance to take a weekend class with Andrew, setting up a Japanese hand plane, you go home with the Japanese hand plane. That's like the coolest thing in the world.
So Vic, do you do anything other than make wispy teeny tiny shavings?
At this moment with it, no.
Because I would just make shavings I'd be like, yeah, I'll be back in a minute.
I have a piece of 2-inch wide by, 1.5 inch wide by 3-inch deep, 3 feet long Port Orford cedar, perfectly straight, perfectly all those things. And I marvel at how much better it works, the Japanese plane, than some of my other wooden planes that I make myself. And that was the whole reason why I was interested in taking that class, because I want to find out what the secret sauce is.
Yeah.
And the problem is that there's 600 ingredients to the secret sauce.
Yes.
And it's like, and every one of them is not more or less important. But if you miss one,
Yes.
it sets the whole thing off. And it's like, oh my goodness. And so I end up, now I'm signed up to go to Kazurukai the weekend there over at Rowan Woodworks. And then I invited myself over to Ben Strano's house. And then I'm going to spend a day and a half with Andrew kind of going over my plane designs and saying like, okay, how do I apply what the Japanese have known for hundreds of years and into a more modern package? So
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome.
It's going to be as nerdy as you could ever imagine.
That is a nerdy week, dude.
It is so nerdy.
Yeah, if I had an Andrew Hunter hand plane, it'd be like the scene from Spinal Tap where I would just hold it up to my ear. Can you just hear the shavings?
Right.
And then like someone reaches like, no, don't touch it. You can't touch it. You just listen. And
if there weren't enough reasons to like Mike Pekovich, the fact that he just used a Spinal Tap reference, it should be
about Japanese hand planes.
About Japanese hand planes. That's a top tenner right there.
Mike, aren't you glad you found your people who appreciate this?
100%. Yeah.
All right, let's answer a question. This first one is from Brad. In Shop Talk Live 322, you just while discussing bevels, you mentioned tapered bevels, something I had never thought of before. Can you explain how to go about creating these? Are there different methods? If so, what method is your go-to when creating them? And I think that episode was a Mike and Nisa me. So Vic, throw you under the bus.
Oh, good.
How would you go about making tapered bevels?
I haven't done a ton of them, only because it hasn't come up. But if I had to go into the shop right now and do one, I would do it with a hand plane. I would mark it out, and then I would do so, the end that tapers more is going to be where I start, and then back it up a little bit, and then take another pass, and then another pass, and then just keep backing it up. Because I feel like the only other way that I've ever done it was I jigged it all get out in order to get it to do what I needed it to do. And it actually was I thought it was unconventional at the time, but of course I was a student at Rosewood at the time, so everything was novel. But what I did was I was inspired by Emile Jacques Roman. And so I wanted to do my sort of version of a torpedo leg. And my version is simpler because Roman was known for being a bit of a maniac as a designer. And then he would expect his woodworkers to be able to figure it out, even though you can't do some of the things he wanted to in wood. But basically what I did was I put a 4-sided blank on a lathe. And then I made a C-channel jig so that basically it rested on the ways of the lathe. And then I tilted one end up, and then I had a router on top
on the
of
jig. You tilted
on the
one
jig.
end. Okay.
Yeah. And then I did a series of passes, and then the lathe had an indexable head. And so I indexed it 1/8 of a turn, did it again, and again. And then, so what I ended up with was an 8-sided tapered leg from top to bottom that worked really well. So that's a good way to do either an entire piece, I think, or you could easily have you could have tried to stop that, but I think there's better ways to do that now that I've spent a little bit more time. But when it comes to just doing, if you just wanted to do where the taper sort of tapers off, I'd prefer to do that with a hand plane, I think, unless I was going into production on something, because otherwise there's just so much time in the setup.
Yeah.
Even figuring out that 8-sided taper, it's pretty simple to describe it, but it took me a half a day of head scratching to sort of come up with that. And then, 10 minutes to do them. So as it normally is when you do a lot of setup like that.
Right. But if it works, then it's all worth the time. Yeah.
That's right.
Well, and on a table, you've got at least 4 legs, 8
Right.
sides of the table. That
Right.
setup was probably a wash, maybe, because
I
it was
think so.
so consistent. So, Mike,
Yeah, I use them a ton, and to Vicks Point, typically it's with a hand plane. Most often it's with a block plane. And a lot of it is I'll try to get things like, say, fitting a door to an opening. I'll try to get those reveals as perfectly parallel as possible. But then if I'm a little bit off and I need to cheat that, or the sides of a drawer and an opening aren't quite perfectly parallel with the sides of the case, I'll use a tapered chamfer to true up that shadow line a little bit. So as long as the shadow is even, everything looks good. That gap looks even. So I tend to be doing pretty subtle tapered chamfers just to kind of visually straighten things out a little bit. Exactly Vic's technique, where what you don't want is you don't want to keep hogging on the side of the heavier taper. You don't want to introduce a curved taper, because that's going to, as long as that's not your intent. The idea is you want a straight facet, which is just tilted along its length. And the only way to do that is by kind of measuring the length of the strokes you're taking. So on a, 20-inch long door side, maybe it's every 2 inches. So 2, 4, 6, 8, whatever that is. The shorter the increment, like if you do 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inch, 4 inch, you're really creating a pretty heavy angled chamfer or bevel. So where if you did 10 inches, 24 inches, that's going to be super subtle. So, typically 2 or 3 inch increments to keep it straight. But then you can intentionally change the variability of the length of the strokes to actually create curves or concaves. In a leg, I have kind of a square tapered leg where I kind of want to create a curve which starts at 0 at the top, comes in really tight at the shoulder, and then kind of eases up toward the bottom. So it's an asymmetric curve. So in that case, I'll start at the deepest part of the curve, and say above the curve, there's only 3 inches. Below the curve, it could be 25 inches, but I'll just subdivide the length above the deepest point by a certain number of segments, and the distance below that deepest point by the same number of segments. So it could be 1/2 inch segments above, but it could be like 4-inch segments below, as long as there's 5 starting points above the deepest point and 5 stopping points below. So then you're doing this series of intentionally offset length chamfers, but as long as you hit your points and those points are evenly spaced out, you end up with really geometrically clean curves. And I love that. I do it every time, and every time it turns out the way I want it, I'm still surprised. So yeah, it's dividing your surface into segments, either regular segments for straight lines or graduated segments if you want to create a curve, whether it's a convex or concave curve. Super cool trick.
And for the love of Pete, don't do it on your project.
Practice
like
it.
if you want to practice that, you know what I mean? Grab a piece of scrap and like play with it. Play with the increments, play with the, try to figure out what you're trying to do. Because if you're looking at 4 table legs that you just cut out of, Babinga or something, and you're super worried about them, that's not the experimentation place.
Yeah.
I recently, someone that we work with, Heather, we had a flood around here, and her basement was flooded out, and she was like, "Hey, I need 4-inch legs for my couch now. I just want it up a little bit higher." I was like, "Yeah, no problem. Bring me one by." Of course, it was like a 10 millimeter thread on the couch foot, as opposed to, it was one of those, come on. everything. And I was sitting there, I just made up, just made little blocks of wood and everything. And I just couldn't help myself. I was going to do a tapered bevel on every one of these couch feet, which will never be seen. And I decided, okay, I'm just going to, I think I threw a chamfer bit in the router table, and I was going to just tape a block to one side and run the chamfers, and it would taper it, however much that block offset that one side, because they're little feet. So it's, a big piece, you couldn't do that as easily. And then I started wandering down the road. I was like, oh, well, I could 3D print like this little saddle that would be perfect. And then all of a sudden I just stopped. I was like, nobody will ever see these ever. And nobody will ever care about your tapered bevels. Just move on with this gig, So that's what life is like with me.
I think you always have to go there, even if it just doesn't make sense to.
Yeah.
It's an opportunity.
Michael Fortune says he does that with design. Like he keeps going and he keeps going and he keeps going until he starts laughing. and then he comes back about 2 or 3 spots, and then that's where he should have stopped.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he's still smiling, but
Right.
He's not quite laughing. That's awesome.
Yeah.
It's good to come back 2 or 3 though. It's like that. Yeah. That's what I used to do in my last career. And that's why I have a different career now. So
yeah, you keep turning until you break it, and then you kind of come back.
Like, no, it's broken. All right. So this question specifically for you two, and I am almost positive we have had this in the list for at least 2 episodes, and it always winds up getting knocked down. And it is the Matt Damon of guests getting bumped. So this one is from Scott. Listening to, and this tells you how long ago this has been written to us, listening to Shop Talk Live 262, I was reminded of a lesson I learned when I was squaring a new sliding compound miter saw. Even though it was not a Festool saw, I was using the Festool instructions, and it recommended a version of the 5-cut method. At the end, it was noted that the method is capable of detecting error that is outside the intended tolerances of the tool. This was a light bulb moment for me. Castings flex, bearings have play, it all adds up. When those variances are expressed in plus or minus terms, I can expect that if I measure the same thing over and over again, I can expect to get the variety of results within that range. And those results will be random and super frustrating, and I will try and force them to go away. With the quality of measuring tools we have available, the question may not be how accurate we need to be, it's more how accurate are we able to be? Are we aiming for a standard that is not only unnecessary, but actually not possible? Mike?
I love this question. I think this is my favorite question ever because it just taps into an aspect of woodworking that really, I think it resonates with a lot of people who come into woodworking who are fairly engineering minded. And you get people, holding something up and it's like, they're just like looking way too hard. It's like, yeah, but if I hold my square up to this end of this board, can you see a little bit of light there? And this is like in a class with a bunch of students and tons of furniture parts and all this. And it's just like, it's good. And I'm not just saying it's good because, it's good enough, but yeah, I mean, it speaks to that level of tolerance for working with an organic material. And if you plane something dead flat right now, tomorrow, it's probably not going to be dead flat. So we're working inherently with imperfect tools in terms of absolute accuracy and imperfect materials in terms of staying the way we want them to stay. So I guess I would say, brilliant. Aim for perfect and have a backup plan. I think that's every single thing. Like square up your crosscut sled, But then if I'm cutting case parts, I'm going to make sure I'm registering, say, the front edge of the part to the fence when I'm cutting the ends, so that if they're not dead square, the two sides have ends that are angled parallel to each other, not opposing each other, and you're introducing this wine. So this is the same thing as like marked triangles. That's your reference surface. This groove is dead center on the table saw with this dado blade. This is perfectly centered. Guess what? It's not. Keep your triangle toward the fence on all your parts, and we're just looking for consistently imperfect. So it's, I think half of it is be very, very careful with your setups, your blade angles, your fence angles, get as square as you can, and then plan on it not being square. So I think hold those two ideas in your head. It's sort of like this dialectic view of accuracy. Yes, it's important. Yes, there are ways around it if you're not absolutely accurate, but a lot of engineering-minded folks coming into the craft, it's hard to let go. Those machinists, oh my gosh, they're like, are you kidding me? You're working to these tolerances? And it's like, yeah, it's okay. Just kind of let it go a little bit. So,
have you had engineering-minded students, Vic?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, you can spot them from a mile away. Trumped only by dentists. Dentists are super fastidious for some reason about everything that they do. And I mean, I guess I get it. I mean, they're working in people's mouths and, they're working with this high-speed drill around all this soft tissue. It's like, I get that you have to be precision oriented. You run into it all the time. And again, I think I've said this before on the show, but I think a lot of people try to make up for lack of skill with hypersensitivity to accuracy. And so if they get this square and this square is good to like 0.001 or 0.004 or whatever, then that means that things are going to be, but when I worked at Veritas, like I'd watch machinists and engineers who were testing things. Like they would use their square and they would like wipe the surfaces of their square and the leg, and then they would put it up, and they'd be very fastidious about putting it up, the reference face up, and then sliding it down until it just contacts the material. No angles, no like doing this along a board, and so there's definitely techniques that are well beyond what we need to be doing in woodworking. And it, like, if you want to get into that, then great. But like I've confiscated dial indicators before. I had one student telling me that his tabletop before lunch was perfect. And then when he came for lunch, now this corner is 4 thou thicker than the others. And I told him I didn't believe him. And he said, check it yourself. And he handed me his dial dial indicators. And I put them in my back pocket. And I said, you'll get these at the end of the class because this is hurting you, not helping you. And so everything you said is 100% true, Mike. Like, we're trying to get consistent inaccuracy, right? There's going to be something that's going to creep in, whether it's simply putting English on the saw head as you're using it, or, leading, if you're using the router, are you using both handles, or do you have one hand on top and one on handle? Like, that's going to change how things are working. But as long as you're consistent with all of that, right, it generally works out in the wash. Yeah. And I mean, like, I'm aware of the 5-cut method for truing something. Never done that. Never.
No, I cut something 5 times and it's still exactly off. So I don't get that. It doesn't work, obviously, is what we're saying. But yeah, it's like, I like in the case of my MFT table, I square the track to the fence, and then I take a test cut on a 12-inch, at least 12-inch wide piece. I check it. If it's square, it's square. If it's not square, it's not square. And then I check it. But I mean, it's like, you could really go off the deep end, and like I've said before, people talk about seeing light, and it's like, photons are real little, people.
Like they get into the sneakiest places.
Yeah.
So seeing light is not an indicator to me of a problem.
No. And then a parallel concept that goes along with shoot for perfect, expect it not to be is then the difference between equal and exact, and why equal is far more important than exact. So if you're cutting parts to a plan size and the plan says 26 inches and there's 2 case sides, it's not critical that they're exactly 26 inches. It's critical that they're equal in length. So if you're going to miss one by a 16th, as long as you miss the other one by the same 16th, we're good. Let's keep on moving.
100%.
So, yeah.
Vic, you said something like that mindset sometimes takes place of skill. I heard that and I felt it, and I almost for me, I think early on that mindset, that accuracy mindset, took the place of bravery and not wanting to continue on with the project because I was scared of continuing on with the project. And I'd sit there and I'd be like, I don't think that is square, and I don't trust my square, and I can't afford to stare it. And this is where this project lies now. And I see it in other people and woodworkers just starting off, where it's like, I'm going to do that when I get this thing. It's this tool or this, when I can get a stare that I trust, then I will move on to the next phase. It's like, no, why don't you check the combo square you have? It's easy enough to do, and then move on.
And you can adjust that square if you have to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially a combination square. They're designed to, you file one of the nibs to make a bit of an adjustment, and, away you go.
Yeah. It's real though. I totally understand it. I've been there where it was just like, I'm not there yet because of this. And it was not because I needed a stare at 12-inch. I needed to just move on because none of those projects are going to be perfect. And that's that, Yeah. So,
and you need to be told, like somebody needs to tell you, right? Like to say, like, listen, you're messing around here. Like everything you've got here is good, right? Like it's good enough, move forward. And I remember hearing those words from various instructors as I was learning. And they're like, Vic, this is good. Like, just move on. Like, you're good. You're good. And anything more than this is a waste. Yeah.
And it's not meant as, oh, that's good enough. That's good enough for you. It's like, it's that understanding of what's super critical and more importantly, what isn't critical. Because like you said, we're trying to do really, really good work. And in the beginning, we're trying to be super focused on every single aspect of the build, which means half the time we're investing too much effort. And the other half of the time on the really critical part, maybe we don't have the bandwidth or energy left or the knowledge to say, no, these things right here, this is super important to get right, but these other things are not important. And I think balancing those two thoughts means you're going to be able to have the time and energy to spend on the important stuff. And to your point, you just need to, okay, this is as good as it needs to be. Let's let it go and move on. Again, it's finding that balance. And you're right, you have to be told. It isn't, when I first started cooking and following recipes and it said, a teaspoon of this or a quarter teaspoon, it's like, oh my gosh, okay, where's that little tiny spoon? It's got to say a quarter. And it's just, is it heaping? Is it flat? I don't know. It's like, all right. Yeah.
Okay. It's heaping. Like even the word infuriates me because I don't know what heaping is. And
well, you put it into whatever it is you're measuring and just let the rest
I can
of it
make
fall
that
away.
Do whatever I want. Trust me. I can make a heaping cup equal to a cup and 2/3.
Yes.
Ben, your heritage is Italian. You should know that it doesn't even matter. You just grab a handful of this and a pinch of that, and then that it all just comes together. You don't need a
handful of this and a pinch of that. Exactly.
Yeah.
That's all you need.
And the accuracy of a diced onion is very different from one national cuisine to another national cuisine. I'm not inserting any names in here, but we all know when you need to get it right and when you don't need to get it right.
Exactly. Let's take a break.
All right.
Woodworkers, from professionals to hobbyists, know the satisfaction of a job well done. Woodcraft is bringing you a new way to turn every project into something rewarding. Introducing Toolbox Rewards. It's free to join, and you'll gain instant access to special offers and members-only rewards. Visit woodcraft.com/toolboxrewards to sign up. It's just another way that since 1928, Woodcraft has been helping you make wood work. I think I've talked about this before in a different instance, but I really hate blaming the tool. And I will go further than I probably should, not being willing to blame the tool. And I recently bought a used CNC for my personal shop, and primarily because with the shop with the fine woodworking CNC, I realized, no, this is something I truly enjoy, and it brings a lot to my work. And I realized though that I needed to be able to readily experiment and try things. So I needed one here. So, sold some stuff, saved up, bought a CNC. And somehow the problems I was having at the work CNC just magically appeared right over there now. And I was trying to, route out 20 thousandths of an inch slots for fret wire for ukuleles.
I saw this
post. Yeah. And I think I bought 10 bits originally at like $5 a piece. And I broke 4 or 5 like immediately at the workshop. And then I was like, okay, something, I reached out to a friend. He kind of talked me through some cam setups and, what are you doing here? What are you doing there? Okay. And everything, confirm everything. It's fine. But I only had a few bits left at this point. I was like, okay, well, I'm going to wait until I have my own CNC and I can really take my time and I can really dial it in. And got the CNC set up, went over the cam again, boom, 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 snap, like immediately, breaks within a quarter of an inch. Reach out to my buddy again. I'm like, what am I like? Come on. And he's like, let's see your settings. And I show him my settings and he's like, this all looks good to me. I was like, it's at some point, maybe it's the bit, and both of us were like, no, the bits are fine, And I just immediately, I had 2 bits left. I dropped one trying to get it into the collet, and that one was broken. And because they're 20 thousandths of an inch thick, so this is teeny tiny. And the last bit just snapped immediately I was using a piece of white oak, which for fretboards, it's really hard wood. And it's like, this is an easy wood for a fretboard. This should be a piece of cake for this process. Just really dejected and, just thinking, why did I'm jumping through all these hoops. I have a saw that I can saw on the line and cut these slots, but ordered new bits, same supplier, different bit, little bit of a shorter length on that bit, and, chucked it up and hit go. And it ran a whole fretboard of frets, and it was just that bit that a third person had said, these are what I use. I think that person just didn't look hard enough for something, and it was a long bit. And sometimes it is the tool. I exhausted every single one of those bad bits before I accepted that I had to buy more bits. So, but sometimes it's the tool, and that's okay.
I feel your pain though. Like that, like every time one snapped, it's just like, it's the worst feeling in the world.
The CNC is a new type of tension because you're watching a thing happen and you can't do anything about it. It is, you're only active before the process starts, and then you hit go. And by the time something is wrong, or something is wrong, it is by far too late.
Right.
And that work piece is now probably spent or whatever, or you just cooked a bit, and sometimes the bits are $30. It is not an autopilot by any stretch of the imagination. It is, you are just packing your stress into this moment as opposed to the entirety of the operation. So, and once you prove to yourself that you can do it, you can just hit go and keep doing it. So,
yeah, a lot of those things, this isn't exactly the same, but it's that notion of concept versus execution. Like, was my thinking wrong in this setup working or not? Or was it my execution was getting in the way of that? So I'm sure it's sort of the same thing. Are you doing it right? Is your execution right? But then again, is the concept correct? Like, should this work? Or am I fighting myself? Am I fighting against something that was inherently not going to work because it wasn't engineered correctly? So you stuck with it and you ended up making it work, though.
Well, and we always talk about, I remember, whenever there's a mishap in the shop, it's like some people just go, oh, it just happened.
Yeah.
And like, especially you and me, Mike, we'll be sitting there over a meal and saying like, no, let's analyze exactly what happened and let's figure out exactly let's watch that again, Yeah. And when something doesn't happen the way that you expect it to, you really do need to break it down, and, but sometimes it just breaks down to the point where everything was right and the tool was wrong. And that's that. There was no settings that I could have put into that machine that were reasonable settings that would have made that thing work. That bit didn't want to go through white oak. I actually tried it through pine too, and it didn't want to go through pine. So, but
cool.
I find when you get into those really small router bits, because I've used some of them sometimes in conjunction with a Dremel and a base, and to do like little bits of inlay stuff or like really small lines. Like, I feel like if the fluted part of the bit is any bit longer than the depth, or sorry, if you're trying to plunge that thing much deeper than its width,
oh, okay,
you're going to run into problems because like it's so fragile that like just any sort of wobble is going to, or like, especially with white oak, like you get like those sort of different densities, right? All of a sudden, like it's good in the soft bit and then bang, it hits that little bit of early wood, late wood. And it just, that's enough to snap it. And so like, I've always tried to get them like as short as possible, because you're never going to plunge that thing like a quarter of an inch. Like you just can't do that with those. But that's good that you were able to like source another bit that, obviously was shorter and, sort of followed that idea.
Well, and it's weird though too, because there's the bits that the manufacturers say are made for this operation, and they happen to be like $30 a piece. Right. And just as delicate. And then there's like the bits that are for like PC board, drilling and no, there's an industry that buys these things by the dozen, and that's who we really care about. Oh, you want 5, it's, I was doing a thing where I did an inlay with a 1mm bit, and the machine just, went as fast as it wanted to go. And it was totally fine. And the 0.2, which is a little bit under 0.5 millimeter, it's like that. That's a totally different world at that point. But yeah, generally with CNC setups, and I would assume like the Shaper Origin operates the same way, where it's like you're generally doing the depth of cut is no more than the width of the bit. So
yeah, and you can even have it like calculate all that out. so that like it knows how big the bit is, and so it makes a recommendation on how many steps, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And you can ignore that if you want.
Yeah.
At your peril.
The program I use for Cam Fusion, it goes into like chip calculations and and it's eventually I will figure it out or learn it or be taught it, more likely, but it's beyond me right now. So just make it go slow. All right. Now we have a tracksaw question. So this one's for you, Mike. This one's from Dave. I'm going to be making some built-ins for my home later this year, and this is going to involve making a series of square or parallel cuts on sheet goods. I don't have a table saw due to historical injury suffered by my father-in-law. My wife has forbidden it. But I have a track saw, and I'll be using that to cut up the plywood. I made a cabinet for my shop last year and made the carcass by cutting to a line drawn off of a square to line it up. While this method got me close to square, I ended up clamping the pieces together and evening them up with a hand plane to get them all square. There must be a better way to get square. What is your recommended method for keeping the tracks square? A couple related questions. When would you choose parallel guides versus a track square? Would a speed square or tri-square be adequate for a relatively small project like mine? And I do not believe he gave the dimensions, but Vic?
Yeah.
Track saw aficionado?
Yeah. So the first thing that you can never assume, and this is true whether or not you're working with a table saw or a track saw, is that the factory edges are good. So they're usually good enough to reference the other side, but they're not, like, you don't want to keep referencing that. And so anybody who uses a track saw, the first thing they do is they decide what their reference surface is going to be. And they do usually a 6 mil rip, which is an easy thing to do with the track saw, because with Festool's saw stops, there's a 6 mil offset. And so you literally just put your track onto the piece, use that as a little spacer, and then now you've kept the cut buried, which all rotating blades like, and you get a nice clean surface without sacrificing a ton of material. You look in a little bit in awe of that.
I didn't know about that 6 mil built into the track or into the parallel.
No, the stops. Like, you know how they have the little stops that you can put on the track so that the saw can't back out?
Okay.
Yeah, it's one of those. I use them all the time because if you use the track with the routers and stuff like that, you can set stops using those.
But how is that giving you an offset of 6 millimeter from the track, from the edge of the track?
Oh, because you're just using it as a spacer. It happens to be 6 millimeters.
Okay. Yeah, so it's like a built-in. Oh, and there's a 3/4 inch edge on this square.
Right. Cool. Yeah, kind of thing.
So you've got a super clean reference edge. How am I getting my next cut, say 23 inches in, but dead parallel to that edge?
Right. So in that case, that would be a good use for parallel guides. Right. So if you have to get an exact copy of that, then that's where parallel guides are very handy, because they can reference that surface, and then you can end up with a nice clean cut.
So parallel guides are the things that attach to the back of the track, right? And you have like 2 stops then. And so it's like kind of a hook stop off the back of the track.
That's right.
Here's my question about parallel guides. And this has bothered me forever. How do you get the parallel guides the same?
You just set them the same.
So we're setting them to a 32 inch line.
Yep.
We're not, this comes back to, are they the same? Or are they 32, or are they set to 32 inches? I just feel like that is like setting the stop to a line and then not being able to set the other stop referencing off of that thing or something like that is saying like, no, they're both on 32 and not necessarily parallel though.
Right. Yeah. No, I know what you're saying.
Am I being the engineering guy in the room?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like, I mean, like, are you putting the stop on the left-hand side of the line, or are you putting it on the right-hand side of the line?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, there's all these and the line is like, I don't know, whatever the line is.
Okay.
But like in the case of cross-cutting, like I will rip that, the long length first, get that nice and clean, and then I'll use a right angle attachment that attaches to the track.
Okay.
And then now I know, then I make a sacrificial cut across the end, right? Keeping in mind that all of this stuff I've broken down first, right? Like I don't get too super crazy, like, kind of like what we do at the table saw, right? Like you'll take a piece of plywood and you'll buck it down to like more manageable chunks, and then you'll take it over the table saw. Well, in this case here, I'll hand cut basically, like, just with a measuring tape and a pencil line, lay the track down, and like I don't care if it's bang on because it doesn't need to be. And then I create that L shape that I know is square, and then all of my referencing happens after that. So that's where it's like, it's the same thing as using a table saw, except the table saw only requires one edge, right? In order to be able to reference on the fence, because then presumably the offcut side is nice and straight, but that's not a guarantee either.
Right.
Right. Because if you've kind of gotten a little wonky as you've gone through the table saw, it may not be good. Right. And we've all seen that, like you push it over to the edge and there's like a little spot that's not touching the fence. And so it's like, So it's like, it's just as nuanced as the table saw is in that sense. You can't just simply set the fence, pop, rip, and just keep doing that, because it's not necessarily going to end up accurate or the same or any of those things. So
now you use stops on your MFT style table, right? So that's to me the point where if you have a fence and a stop, and then the track that is set square to the fence, that to me is the point where you're replicating probably table saw accuracy, right?
Right, yeah, because I mean, you're putting...
Or repeatability more.
Right,
so,
yeah, exactly. And so you're putting it up against the stop, it's up against a fence, and then the track is in a device that is holding it, whether it's the sort of OEM Festool version or some aftermarket version. It's going to, because you're going to take a second, just like you check your table saw fence, once in a while to make sure it's good. You're going to check this fence and stop relationship to make sure it's good. And then, you can just do repeatable cuts all day, every day. But there's definitely reference surfaces are critical.
And order of operations.
Yeah. Like you can't just, if you rip that straight edge, well, now there's no guarantee that perpendicular line is perpendicular.
Right.
There's no guarantee of that at all. In fact, by doing it the way I was describing, by just sort of like using this random piece of plastic as that offset, all you're doing is creating a really straight line, right? But now you have to true that up. And then if you get confused and then accidentally reference the other side of the piece of plywood, well, now all bets are off. And it's no different than what Mike was talking about earlier about like the reference surfaces matter. And if you go and you put a non-reference surface up against a fence or up against a stop or whatever, now everything's off the table.
Is there any reason why Dave couldn't sandwich two pieces together and do all of the cuts and be assured that they are now, like Mike likes, the same?
Equal. Yeah.
Equal.
Yeah, I often will do that.
Okay.
And so I'll break my pieces down into smaller pieces. I'll create that reference surface, and then I'll sandwich them together. And then, yeah, like Mike said, they're off, but they're off together. And so it works perfectly. No different than what he did basically with the plane.
Yeah.
Right. He sandwiched them together and adjusted it. Well, you would do the exact same thing. And that's a nice thing I think about a track saw is that you can put 3 or 4 layers of whatever underneath the track saw and then just do it all in one pass.
What's the depth of cut on a normal track saw? Like with a
55 can do just over 2 inches.
Really?
Yeah. Huh, and then the 75, which is the bigger one, it can do just over 3 inches, I believe. And if I'm wrong, I'm sure someone will tell me. But
just leave a question. Just leave it in a comment on YouTube.
Yep.
Because that helps engagement.
Yep. Exactly. And always start with Vic, you're an idiot, and then make your comment.
That's how I text you.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. But yeah, so you can get through quite a bit of stuff, all in one pass. And oftentimes, if I have a bunch of pieces that I've made, I'll stack them up, put them all up against the fence and stop, and then cut them all at once. It's the same thing. It's the same thing with cutting. If you're going to cut a bridle joint, let's say you're making a workbench base and you're going to cut a bridle joint, I stack all my legs up. I put the track saw down and I cut one shoulder, and then I move them all over and I cut the other shoulder. And then they're all identical.
There you go.
Which you can't do on a table saw. Well, I suppose you could, but I wouldn't.
You okay, Mike?
No, my cat is trying to get to the window.
Get through the window?
To the window. I have a big stack of magazines and books here, and she's she's
not
sorry
happy with you.
My apologies.
Squirrel.
So, Mike, you just so that the listening audience knows, Mike made his entire kitchen cabinets with a
panel saw,
like in Home Depot.
Yep.
So, not the most, maybe not known for the most accurate tool. You know what? There's a lot of pros out there that just leave a comment on YouTube and just say, Ben, you're an idiot. Because they are probably plenty accurate, but,
I have a saying, it's plywood. That's all I'm going with.
Doesn't matter.
It's plywood. I don't do high-end plywood construction. I know you can. There's a lot of veneering. You can be super accurate. But for me, if I'm working with plywood, I'm just busting this thing out. And if it's a kitchen cabinet, the face frame openings have to be square for the door. Nothing else behind that has to be square. So, yeah. No, panel saw, man. I bucked out parts for an entire kitchen in an afternoon. That was the most beautiful thing in the world. So whatever that accuracy was, that was fine for me.
I've never seen anyone so heartbroken when a panel saw went away.
Yeah, that was rough.
That does it for this episode of Shop Talk Live. If you are watching on YouTube, I appreciate you clicking that thumbs up button. It helps, I swear. And if you feel called to, please leave a 5-star review on iTunes or Apple Music or Spotify or whatever you're listening to these days. And let everyone else know that this is a really good show for woodworkers to listen to. We appreciate it. Also, this show survives on your questions, so send them into shoptalk@finewoodworking.com. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode. Thanks for listening.